Welcome back to Sika Strength and welcome back to Sika Stan. I'm Owen. This is Dara. We are weightlifting coaches. We have coached thousands of weightlifters across approximately about 25 years of weightlifting between the two of us. And there's a lot of different things we've learned, and we want to help you as much as possible in your own training to adjust and adapt and get the best results in the shortest time possible, so you don't have to waste time in training and you can learn from our mistakes and what we've learned from other great lifters and coaches. Now, one of the big things in weightlifting is it's a very dynamic sport. The programming, while quite rigid in our start and end destinations or our start and end goals, the journey in the middle is quite dynamic, maybe if you compare it to powerlifting, for example. Powerlifting is a sport where it's months and months on end of doing very, very similar things, slowly accruing and adding weight and maybe volume to that programming. But weightlifting, a little bit more dynamic. The movements are incredibly dynamic, and the sport and the programming itself kind of reflects that in some fashion. So sometimes there's a case for changing things in a program. It might be changing the variation, it might be changing the loading, it might be changing the frequency of a certain lift, it might be changing how much you're squatting, how much you need to squat now, it might be changing how often you're going heavy. There's lots of different variables that we need to change and might need to change in a weightlifting program. But it's very hard to know, are you changing them because you're being a little bitch, or are you changing them because it's the right thing to do? And both of those cases happen very, very frequently. A lot of times, just because you don't like doing your sets of 5 in the pulls and your coach told you to, your pauses in these 5 and pulls, and you think this is doing nothing for me, I don't like these, or maybe you don't like low block snatches, but you should be doing the low block snatches. It's hard to be objective about when the changes need to be made and when the change should be made and when it shouldn't be made. So we have a lot of different variables, and there's a lot of different things involved in making that decision. So what have we got first?
So the first thing is, what is mid-block? Like, what is mid-program? For most weightlifters, you'll just do a weightlifting program, and you mightn't necessarily have a full understanding of what's going on behind the scenes here. So depending on what programming you run, depending on what paradigm you choose to follow, you might have very defined blocks. So you might have off-season, then a prep phase, then a training phase or a realization phase, and then a peaking phase or a competition phase. Now, if you're in one of those blocks, it's very important to understand firstly, the outcome and timelines of those blocks, but also what's coming afterwards. So if you're in that situation Owen is talking about, you've identified an issue that's there, the first thing is figure out where you actually are on that map. So if we're in one of those prep phases and the volume is quite high and the exercise selection is not quite as important, then you understand that this is where I am now. Maybe those changes are something that I need to think about in 4 weeks' time. Now, that contrasts to if you're in that realization phase or that specific training phase, the exercise selection becomes incredibly important. So let's define each of these phases firstly. Off-season, we're mainly concerned with building general physical preparedness, gaining that work capacity across our entire athletic range. I want to be gaining some lean tissue mass. I want to be probably losing some of that fat mass. I want to be getting quite cardiovascularly fit. And maybe, depending on my particular strength biases, I might be working on a few of those worse lifts or working on a few of my worse areas. Maybe my strict press needs to go up. Maybe my back squat needs to go up. Maybe I need more of an emphasis on posterior strength. That's what happens in our off season. Now, the prep phase then is the next block we get into. And what prep phase looks like is it looks like our off-season piece, except more of our specific lifts start coming in. So we have more snatches, more cleans, and more jerks. But our big focus now is building work capacity across the snatch, the clean, and the jerk. So across all of these things, I'm essentially earning my right to go and train those lifts heavier. Now, this doesn't mean I'm going to be doing 10s in the snatch. A lot of the time during that prep phase for the snatch, we'll still have doubles and singles like we will in our specific phase. But what we're doing is a lot of volume in those triples, doubles, and singles. Maybe I have shorter rest periods in between all of them. But this is basically the training phase where I am training to be able to train properly. It's earning the right to go and do my proper training block afterwards. Now, the next block is weightlifting programming. This is what most weightlifters will be doing on a very regular basis. This is going through those triples, doubles, singles, working my way up slowly through the weight, refining my technique as I go through. For some of those people who might prescribe to that more concurrent style of training, this is where you'll spend the majority of your year. Now, with today's video and today's question in mind, this is where that main question occurs. If I am in this phase of training, this is probably where some of that jiggering around and shifting of focus will occur. The final phase then is my peak. It's my taper. It's as I come into that competition, what's going to happen. This is a very sensitive period of training. This is a period of training you're going to be well aware that you're already in, because your competition is probably 4, 5 or 6 weeks away.
Now, so we've decided, or we understand where we're at in our training, we need to understand how serious the adjustments that we would like to make or need to make are. So if it's a like-for-like adjustment on an assistance exercise, it could be largely meaningless for everything but the peak week. So if you're doing strict presses and you want to change to dumbbell strict presses at the same time, it's a very low change. It's fairly basic exercise. It's low enough on the order of importance. So it's not a massive deal, especially if you're in that off-season phase that I was talking about, or we're midway through the block and you're just kind of sick of doing presses from the front and you want to change to presses behind the back. That is largely irrelevant. You're looking for a pressing motion that goes overhead. You're looking to train your delts, your shoulders, maybe a bit of mid-back and traps or something similar like that. And you might change the position. Maybe you go to seated, or maybe you even go to a machine press. That kind of change, pretty low kind of risk to reward ratio on changing out those exercises, unless of course you know that maybe your strict press is largely tied to how good you can jerk. So in that case, that would be a poorer change. But for most of the cases, if you were going to dumbbell row to seal row, it's not a massive change. Now we've gotten into a bit more serious changes. Maybe we're midway through the block and we want to switch from low block snatches to low hang snatches. So pretty similar change in the variation, but we need to be a little bit more thoughtful on that, because if we're on week 3, we've decided, week 3 of 12, we've decided that low hang snatches aren't something that we really like doing, or it's irritating our back. Switching immediately into that low block snatch isn't a massive deal. We can focus on the same attributes or same technical issues that we're working on. We can probably keep the loading pretty similar. It's not a main variation of the lifts. You're not heading for your peak on week 3 of 12, and so it's not going to have a major impact on your single. Now, however, if we're on halfway through week 10 of 12 and you're doing low block snatches and you suddenly want to go back to low hang snatches, this is a terrible time to change that, because even though the variation is quite similar, there's different loading. There's an eccentric portion to that low hang. We're going to be putting a bit more fatigue. It's going to require a lot more mental resources to focus on that variation. So when we go for heavy singles, we've wasted time on a variation that's not massively important at this stage, or rather it's not going to have a major impact either in a positive direction for your snatching or clean and jerking, whatever that variation you're looking at. And realistically, it's probably just going to have more of a negative impact on that peak. So we need to know where we are and then how serious that adjustment is to make sure that we are adjusting in the right place and for the right reasons. Then we have stuff like technical adjustments. So technical adjustments are quite interesting. Technical adjustments are something that can be changed and will be worked on for essentially the entirety of your career until you're someone like Gabriel Sincrean, for example. Gabriel Sincrean, as you know, snatched 190 kilos. And I asked him one time, what was he thinking about when he snatched 190 kilos? And he said pretty much nothing. So this is in regards to not that he had thought about nothing for the previous 15 years of weightlifting. Rather, he thought about all the things that he needed to think about, and then they ended up transferring to that 190, and they were so ingrained in him, he didn't need to think about it that much anymore. For example, my best ever snatch currently is 155 kilos, and up to 2 or 3 weeks beforehand, I was working on a little bit of an adjustment, a small adjustment to the cue, where I was pulling the barbell back a little bit more aggressively off the floor, and it went very well on the day. So there are small adjustments we can make that are very, very useful, and that can be very important to change as time goes on. And the further out we change them, the more useful they can be on our heavier lifts. However, if we're making a massive change, that might have differences on the specific muscle groups we're looking at. So maybe you have a snatch grip that's too narrow. You're on week 10 of 12. The weights are pretty heavy. You're probably on 85% plus now. If we go from a slightly too narrow grip to a wider grip, we're possibly risking an acute injury. We're possibly putting more pressure on our wrists, maybe more on our shoulders. We're going to change our timing a little bit. So we're going to mess up those next couple of sessions. If it's 2 weeks away from a peak, you might have between 4 and 9 snatch sessions left, depending on how experienced you are, and you're compromising a lot of the number of those sessions. So in some cases, you're actually better off not making that change. You're better off not making that technical change. You're better off not making the variation adjustment. And you're better off just powering through, finishing the block, getting a good representation of what you did, and then starting that adjustment at the start of the next block. But it's not always a case of, even though it might be the right choice for you, you have a competition in 3 weeks. Now isn't the time to make that technical change. Even though you might need to make that technical change, we need to be converging and narrowing down the technical focus that we're doing for competition. And even though it's at the compromise of long-term performance, it is very important to finish those blocks through, and it is supposed to give you an opportunity to have a good short-term performance with the understanding that this isn't right now, I need to change it, but this is a terrible time to change it.
The next thing, or the final thing to consider when you're looking at whether to make the change now or just wait a bit, is what is the end outcome here. So depending on what you're training for, depending on how important competitions are for you, there can be a host of things happening at the end of the peak. So the first thing that could be happening is you're just taking a break. You're taking a week of deload or 2 weeks of deload. Maybe you're going on holiday or vacation. And in that case, if the change is something to do with a bit of overload, maybe you're just very fatigued from training, in that case, you can probably hammer through. Like Owen was talking about, there's only a small bit of time left. You can just get there. You'll get across the line. You'll get those big PBs and you'll be good to go afterwards. Now, for many of us, this won't be the case. It's more and more common now where we have athletes in weightlifting competing in weightlifting style leagues where they're competing maybe every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks. In the case of for these athletes, you can't really just power through. So although you might only be doing 5 or 6 competitions throughout the year, you're probably doing them in quite a condensed block. And if we suddenly just start powering through everything and not taking that kind of impetus to make the change now when I need to make it, then in that case, you could spend most of your year in non-ideal training conditions. And so when we're looking at our training, when we're looking at it, there's no major rush with anyone, but we want to be efficient with it. We want to make the changes when the changes need to be made. We want to make what's known in the performance psychology world as decisive decisions. If the decision needs to be made, we just need to make it right now. We don't want to waste a huge amount of time thinking about it. Now, there's the other option here where the competition you're doing might be the biggest competition of your career. In that case, that seesaw, that decision you're going to make is much more difficult because in that case, you have to weigh up the possible outcome of just powering through and maybe pushing the weights a small bit more for the last few weeks. Or are you going to make the technical change and hope that technical change is the correct decision? Now, this is one of the reasons weightlifting is such a difficult sport. It's incredibly technical. It's difficult for you to make those changes on your own. And even if you have a very experienced coach with you, it's a difficult decision to weigh up. They only have 5 weeks left. If we stop them doing that weird little shuffle step in their jerk, if we stop it now, I'm going to have to pull back the loading by maybe 10 or 15 kilos for 2 weeks of the remaining 5. Is that going to make enough of a difference at the big competition? So this is difficult. This is why sitting down with your coach and discussing this, or sitting down with your program and really refining those numbers, refining those days and having a very well set out plan is so vital. This is one of the hardest aspects for weightlifters to go through, is that weighing up of this is a massive competition. Performance is incredibly important to me now. What should I do next? Now, the final thing you could be doing afterwards is going into a nice strength training phase. And many of the technical changes or specific outcomes we need from training can be corrected during these strength training phases. So maybe your overhead position is slightly soft when you're catching or receiving the snatch or the jerk. Maybe that could be fixed with 6 weeks of strict pressing. In many cases, when we know we have a strength phase coming up afterwards, we'll do our very best with the coaching cues in that training program. We'll do the very best with the direct cue, whether that be verbal cues, visual cues, kinesthetic cues in the training sessions themselves, but it won't directly influence what the training program will look like for those remaining few weeks. So in the same case again, we have weak overhead position, those elbows are slightly soft in the catch. Maybe we're just going to really emphasize it, really drill it and cue it as hard as we can with the athlete, really make that the priority of their focus, load their pre-performance routines with thoughts of strong elbow lockout in the catch position, and then we know we're going to fix it afterwards with a strength phase.
Now, coaching weightlifting is both an art and a science. Both of these are very, very important combinations of two. We need to understand muscle physiology, we need to understand loading, periodization, training methods, psychology of the athlete. We also understand when it needs to be applied, how it needs to be applied. We can take a big part of that away from you and put it into the hands of the Sika Strength app on iOS and Android. This will take a lot of that thinking away from you so you can show up to the gym, do what you need to do. Dynamic loading adjustment, CoachBot, video library, all that great stuff available to you. And we do weekly live streams on our Facebook group for athletes when they have technical feedback that they need or they have questions, so you're not left adrift in the sea of the programming. We're here to help you, as well as the app will help you adjust your training sessions. So check that out on Sika Strength on iOS and Android. There'll be a link down below for both those for you to check them out. There's a weightlifting program, snatch specific programs, power clean program, and a jerk specific program, among obviously the mainstream weightlifting program, squatting and pulling programs.